Cindy, holding a worn backpack, walked up the creaky wooden steps of the ranch porch. Her gaze slid over the space around her, the hills covered in a blanket of snow, the cozy smoke from a brick chimney, the gentle winter sun piercing the blue sky. This place seemed like a fairy tale, but she knew that for her it would be just another stop. "Welcome, dear," the owner of the ranch, Betty Lockwood, opened the door with a wide smile. Her round face glowed with warmth, and her blue eyes radiated sincerity. "Thank you for having me," Cindy replied, smiling shyly. Betty took her backpack and gestured for her to come inside. "You're welcome. There's always room for a good person here." "Well, shall I show you your room?" Cindy stepped through the threshold and found herself in a house where an atmosphere of comfort and family reigned. The living room was decorated with a huge Christmas tree, hung with colorful balls and garlands, and a fireplace crackled in the corner. "It's so beautiful," Cindy whispered, as if afraid to break the silence. "Oh, we love Christmas." Betty laughed. "By the way, you're just in time. We're starting to prepare for the big dinner tomorrow." Cindy nodded, feeling a slight anxiety recede. Betty led her into a small room on the second floor. There was a simple wooden closet, a bed with a fluffy blanket, and a window overlooking the snow-covered fields. "Make yourself at home," Betty said, leaving her backpack on the bed. "If you need anything, just say so." Cindy nodded, smiling gratefully. When the door closed behind Betty, she sat down on the bed, breathing in the smell of wood and fresh air. This place seemed too good to be true. She pulled a small photo album out of her backpack, the only thing she had left from her past. Opening it, she glanced at an old photo of her mother. "I hope I can stay here for a while," she whispered, running her finger over the image. The first day of work at the ranch began early. Cindy left the house in a warm jacket and boots, enjoying the frosty air. In the distance, she saw a barn with voices coming from it. "Hey, are you new?" a guy unloading hay called out to her. "Yeah, I'm Cindy," she responded, coming closer. "I'm Jackson. We all help each other out here. If anything happens, just ask," he winked. She thanked him and headed toward the horses. A tall man with a sullen expression stood at the barn gate. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and his arms were crossed over his chest. "Are you Cindy?" he asked sharply, looking at her intently. "Yes," she answered shortly, trying not to show her embarrassment. "Nigel Lockwood," he introduced himself. "I'm in charge here." His voice was low, and his gaze was cold. "I hope you realize there's a lot of work to do. The horses need to be fed, groomed, and exercised." Cindy couldn't help but smile sarcastically. "I think I can handle it. I've been here a while." Nigel raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. "Then don't waste your time talking. Aspen is waiting for you," he said, nodding toward the snow-white stallion. Cindy glanced at the horse and immediately realized that this would not be the easiest task. She spent several hours tending to Aspen, calming him down as he grew nervous under her touch. Slowly, a connection began to form between them. Nigel watched from afar, arms crossed over his chest. He couldn't help but admit that there was more to this girl than she seemed. As the sun began to set, Cindy finished her work and headed toward the house. "You did well," Nigel's voice suddenly came. She turned around and met his gaze. "Thank you," she replied. "Perhaps you underestimated me?" His lips twitched slightly, as if he wanted to smile, but held back. "We'll see what happens next," he replied, and there was something in his voice that Cindy couldn't quite place. She left, feeling her heart pounding faster. Maybe this place would actually be more than just another stop? Cindy woke up the next morning to the sounds of a rooster and barking dogs. Her first full day at the ranch began with a cup of hot tea in the kitchen, where Betty was already working on breakfast. "Good morning, dear," the woman greeted her, passing her a plate of pancakes. "We're going to have a busy day today." Cindy nodded, enjoying the cozy atmosphere and delicious food. "Where is everyone?" she asked, not noticing the other members of the family. "Jackson has been out in the field since early this morning, and Nigel." Betty paused, is probably in the barn. I'm sure he's already busy with his horses. Cindy nodded, knowing that her work today would be connected with Nigel. She put on a warm sweater, a thick vest, and boots, and then headed to the stable. The stable greeted her with warmth and the smell of hay. Among the horses, she immediately noticed Aspen, who looked calmer than yesterday. He's gotten used to you, a voice said behind her. Cindy turned around and saw Nigel. His face was serious, but his gaze was a little softer than the day before. Good morning, she replied. I think we found a common language. Nigel narrowed his eyes. That doesn't mean he won't test your mettle. Today, I want you to take him out for a ride. Cindy was surprised. Usually, such horses were entrusted to experienced riders. Are you sure? She asked carefully. Want to prove that you can handle it? Then go for it, he replied, throwing her the bridle. Cindy glanced at Aspen, feeling a little nervous. But the fear quickly gave way to determination. She led Aspen out into the field, where the horse was a little nervous at first, but soon settled under her steady hand. The snow crunched softly under their feet, and the air was crisp and slightly frosty. Not bad, Nigel's voice came from behind her. Have you been testing me? She asked with a grin, stroking the horse's neck. I wanted to make sure you wouldn't run away if something went wrong, he replied, smiling slightly for the first time. His smile caught Cindy off guard. She felt her heart begin to beat faster. Had doubts? She asked, looking up at him. Maybe, he replied. But I see you're doing well now. For a moment their eyes met, and time seemed to stand still. A light wind played with her hair, and something flashed in his eyes that Cindy could not explain. Later, back in the house, Cindy could not get that moment out of her mind. She felt that some invisible game had begun between them. Betty, noticing her thoughtfulness, came closer. Nigel has a difficult character, but when he begins to trust you, it is worth a lot, she said with warmth in her voice. Cindy only nodded, but inside her thoughts were spinning around what she saw in his eyes. Evening conversations by the fire. After dinner, the whole family gathered around the fireplace. The Lockwoods discussed the upcoming Christmas preparations, but Cindy noticed that Nigel was keeping a little to himself. When the others went to their rooms, he remained by the fireplace, throwing dry logs into the fire. Do you often stay alone like this? Cindy asked, carefully approaching. He looked up, slightly surprised by her question. Sometimes. It's easier to think here, he answered shortly. What do you think about? Nigel smiled, but didn't answer. Instead, he suddenly changed the subject. And you? Why do you always move? Cindy hesitated. It just happened. I've never had a home, a real home. I'm used to moving on, she answered, looking at the fire. And now? His voice became softer. She turned her head towards him, feeling his gaze penetrate her soul. I don't know now, she admitted. Again, silence, but this time it was a silence full of mutual understanding. Cindy felt that something special was beginning between them, but whether it would mean something more was still a mystery. The next day, Cindy was busy with the horses again from the early morning. Aspen still needed her care, but this time he was more accommodating, as if the trust between them was growing. She felt herself becoming a part of this place with each passing day, but at the same time there was a growing sense that something was holding her back from being completely open. A truckload of hay arrived at the ranch around lunchtime. Cindy, helping Jackson unload it, noticed Nigel watching her work closely. Are you testing me again? She asked, wiping the sweat from her forehead and looking over her shoulder at him. Just watching you get by, he replied, leaning against the barn post. His face was expressionless, but a small smile flickered at the corners of his lips. Admit it, you thought I'd run away in a few days, she continued, handing him a bundle of hay. Maybe, he admitted honestly, taking her load. But you seem different from the others. The others? Cindy asked, sensing that he was revealing a little of his character. People often come here thinking they can handle it easily. But this place requires effort and patience. Not everyone is up to it. Cindy thought about his words. She felt like he was talking about his life as well as the ranch. After work, Nigel asked her to go for a walk outside the ranch. She was surprised by his invitation, but she couldn't refuse. They walked through the snow-covered fields, enjoying the silence that was broken only by their footsteps in the snow. "Have you always been this lonely?" Cindy asked, breaking the silence. "It's not loneliness," he answered without looking at her. "It's a choice." "And you're happy?" He slowed his pace, turning to face her. "And you? Are you happy moving all the time?" Cindy paused, feeling that his words had hit the mark. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I guess I'm looking for something that will make me feel like I'm home." Nigel looked at her carefully, as if trying to read her thoughts. "Maybe this place will be your home," he said quietly. Cindy felt her heart beat faster. That evening, when they returned to the ranch, Betty was already setting the table. The air was filled with the aroma of homemade soup and freshly baked bread. "You guys are great. I hope you're hungry," she said, handing them their plates. Cindy noticed Nigel glance at her briefly before taking the seat opposite. After dinner, she went to her room, but it took a long time to fall asleep. Thoughts of Nigel occupied her mind. His words, his looks, all this seemed to stir her soul, awakening feelings that she was afraid of. Late in the evening, Cindy decided to go outside to get some fresh air. The winter air was crisp, and the stars overhead were especially bright. "Can't sleep?" a familiar voice rang out. She turned to see Nigel standing by the stables, holding a steaming cup of tea. "Looks like you do too," she said, stepping closer. "Sometimes the nights are the best time to think," he said, handing her the cup. Cindy took it, feeling the hot tea warm her hands. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, looking up at him. Nigel looked at her for a long moment before answering. "That I could allow myself to believe in something more than the usual routine." His words caught her off guard. It was a confession that sounded so sincere that Cindy felt an invisible spark run between them. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world around them seemed to disappear. Cindy felt Nigel reach out and gently touch her cheek. "Are you afraid to stay?" he asked quietly. She didn't have time to answer. Betty's sudden call from inside the house interrupted the moment, causing them to quickly pull away from each other. "Guess the stars can wait," Nigel muttered, stepping away. Cindy nodded, feeling her heart pounding. Her feelings for Nigel were growing, and she didn't know how to deal with it. There was something new in the air the next day. Cindy woke up earlier than usual, still remembering the night before. Every word Nigel said, every move he made, was as vivid as a fresh footprint in the snow. She headed to the barn, where her morning work was already waiting for her. Aspen greeted her with a soft neigh, as if he understood her mood. "Morning, handsome," she said softly, running her hand down his neck. Cindy began cleaning the stall when she suddenly noticed Nigel in the far corner. He was checking something in the saddle shop. "Do you always start so early?" she called after him. Nigel turned around, his face set in concentration. "Do you always ask questions?" he replied with a smile. "Only when I want to know more about a person," she threw back, sensing a slight challenge in his tone. He came out of the saddle shop, leaned against the counter, and looked at her carefully. "And what do you want to know?" Cindy froze, not expecting him to ask the question so frankly. "Why do you keep everyone at a distance?" she decided. Nigel frowned, but did not turn away. "It's easier than losing someone who has become close," he said quietly. The words hung in the air, and Cindy felt that he had opened up a part of his soul to her. In the evening, the Lockwoods had a family dinner. Betty served her signature pies, and Jackson told funny stories from the past. The atmosphere was cozy, and Cindy felt part of this family. In the middle of the evening, a man of about 50 arrived at the ranch. It was Henry, an old friend of the family, who used to visit the ranch often, but lately he rarely visited them. Henry! You are as unexpected as always, Betty exclaimed, hugging the guest. I couldn't help but stop by before Christmas, he answered with a smile. Henry immediately noticed Cindy. Who is this? He asked, nodding in her direction. This is Cindy, Nigel interjected before anyone could answer. She helps us out at the ranch. Henry gave Nigel a careful look, then turned back to Cindy. Nice to meet you. I hope you like it here, he said. Very, she replied, feeling warmth spreading inside from such attention. After dinner, everyone went outside to enjoy the clear winter evening. Henry lit a small fire, around which everyone gathered. Cindy sat next to Nigel, feeling his presence more than usual. Henry, noticing how they exchanged glances, narrowed his eyes slightly. Nigel, have you finally found someone who can stand your stubbornness? He asked with a clear note of humor. Nigel gave him a stern look, but did not answer. Cindy blushed, but also remained silent. When the conversation died down, Nigel suddenly stood up. Cindy, do you mind taking a walk? He asked quietly. She nodded, feeling her heart beat faster. They walked in silence until they were away from the others. The snow crunched under their feet, and the air was filled with the freshness of a winter night. What did you want to say? Cindy was the first to break the silence. Nigel stopped and looked at her. I've avoided closeness with anyone for a long time, he began. It's become a habit for me, a defense against pain. What changed? She asked quietly. You burst into my life, and I can't pretend that I don't feel anything anymore, he answered, taking a step closer. Cindy froze, feeling how his words penetrated straight to her heart. I'm afraid too, she admitted. Afraid of losing again the place that has become dear to me. Nigel reached out, gently took her hand and looked into her eyes. Maybe instead of being afraid, we can try to be happy? Cindy felt her eyes fill with tears. She nodded, unable to hold back a smile. Their first kiss under the stars was warm, despite the winter chill. It was the moment that changed everything. A week passed. Christmas was already knocking at the door, and the Lockwood ranch was alive with pre-holiday bustle. The whole house was decorated with bright garlands, it smelled of cinnamon, spruce, and freshly baked goods. Cindy tried to distract herself with things, helping Betty with cooking dinner and decorating the tree, but thoughts about the future did not give her peace. Her work at the ranch was coming to an end, and her heart sank at the thought of having to leave. Until recently, this place had been just a temporary shelter for her, but now it had become the home she had dreamed of all her life. Nigel had become a part of her soul, but the fear of the unknown and the possibility of losing everything again made her hesitate. The entire Lockwood family and several of their friends gathered for Christmas dinner. The atmosphere was warm, filled with laughter and conversation. Cindy watched Jackson tell one of his funny stories, and Betty carefully made sure that everyone had enough food. Nigel sat across from her, sometimes casting such deep glances at her that she felt like he could see right through her. After dinner, everyone went outside to set off the celebratory fireworks. The sky lit up with bright lights, and each explosion was accompanied by excited exclamations. Cindy stood a little to the side, watching the fireworks. Suddenly, she felt Nigel approach her. It's beautiful, isn't it? He said quietly, standing next to her. Yes, she answered, not taking her eyes off the sky. It's a shame that this Christmas will be my farewell. Nigel froze. A shadow darkened his face, but he quickly pulled himself together. And you're ready to just leave? He asked, turning to her. Cindy looked at him, unable to hide her tears. It's not that easy, Nigel. I don't know if I'll fit into your life. He stepped closer, took her hands, and looked into her eyes. Cindy, you're already in it. You've become what I feared most, the reason I'm willing to change everything. She froze, his words like a bolt of lightning. But what if I screw it up? She whispered. Nigel smiled and touched her cheek gently. We're both imperfect, but that's what makes us real. Just stay. Not for me, not for the ranch, but for yourself. The next morning, Christmas morning, Cindy woke up early. She quietly crept out of her room and went outside. The ground was covered in fresh snow, sparkling in the first rays of the sun. She spotted Nigel by the stable. He seemed to be waiting for her. "You're early," she said, coming closer. "I wanted to show you something," he replied with a mysterious smile. Nigel led her to the far paddock where Aspen stood. On his back was a saddle decorated with a Christmas wreath. "What is this?" Cindy asked, surprised. "This is your gift," he said. "Aspen is yours now." Cindy was shocked. "But, why?" Nigel came closer, took her hand, and looked into her eyes. "Because you found your place. You don't have to go anywhere anymore." Cindy felt tears of joy welling up in her eyes. "I'm staying," she said without another second's thought. Nigel smiled, and their kiss against the backdrop of snowy fields was filled with all the magic of Christmas. Now Cindy not only had a home, but also someone she wanted to share her future with.